Welcome to Fee 3 Pot, Political Theory. My name is Miriam Bankovsky, and I'm an associate professor in the politics program. My core background is in political philosophy, although of late I have retrained in economics and the history of economic thought. I have one book out on political philosophy called Perfecting Justice in Rawls, Habermas and Honneth. And I also have a book out this year in History of Economic Thought, which I think has overlaps to political philosophy. It's called Economics and the Family, a Social and Political History. This is the first time that we have taught this unit ever. And I'm really pleased to be able to work through the material with you this semester. It's unusual to be able to teach a unit for the first time, so I'm relishing that opportunity with you. And I've chosen to focus this unit on contemporary political philosophy, contemporary political theory, so that we can closely analyse the intersection between the way in which political philosophy has emerged in response to historical conflict, divisive conflict, from the 1960s to the present. As I said, I'm looking forward to working through the material with you this semester, and looking forward to meeting you on Thursday. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this lecture on Wurundjeri land on the Bundoora campus in Naarm, Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge the resilience of the Indigenous peoples from this area and from Australia, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So the plan for today is to ask and answer the following questions. First of all, what is contemporary political theory? Why study contemporary political theory today? How will we study it in this subject? Then I'll provide an overview of the subject and deal briefly with expectations in the coming week and how you can prepare. So let's turn to part one. What is contemporary political theory? We'll deal briefly with what is theory, then what is political theory, what is contemporary political theory, and then we'll draw in part for these considerations on the text that you're asked to read, the first text by David Miller in your required readings. Why do we need political philosophy? And then we'll turn to John Rawls' remarks on political philosophy, where John Rawls offers a twist. He says, to be honest, we really shouldn't think of political theory as theory. Political philosophy is not theory. Political theory is not theory. And that's why he prefers to use the term political philosophy rather than theory. He'll assign 4 roles to political philosophy, and then we'll consider a historical perspective on these definitions. In the first required reading for this week by David Miller, entitled Why Do We Need Political Philosophy?, the chapter begins by considering Ambrogio Lorenzetti's allegory of good and bad government. And I've provided you with a depiction of that fresco, that part of the fresco that Miller discusses here. You can see the depiction of a ruler seated alongside others who represent courage, justice, magnanimity, peace, prudence and temperance. And David Miller points out that there's also a rope or some kind of attachment between that ruler, who's meant to embody those virtues of good governance, good government, a rope attaching the ruler to the people below. And this is the beginning of a chapter by Miller that looks briefly at the history of political philosophy, to make a case for political philosophy as produced by people in historical context facing a variety of different problems, where political philosophers address their audience and try to persuade them to agree with the arguments that they make about the nature of good government as opposed to bad government. And so it's with David Miller's remarks on why do we need political philosophy that we begin this week. And I hope that you have now read it, or if you haven't, please do before the tutorial. We won't ourselves here deal with Miller's brief history of political philosophy in time, but I thought that might be a useful introduction to a course on contemporary political philosophy, contemporary political theory. What we will now do instead is try to break down what we mean by contemporary political theory. First, let's consider what's meant by theory. Well, we normally think of the term theory as standing for an explanatory or descriptive enterprise. A scientific theory of a phenomenon in the natural world would be an explanation of that phenomenon, or an explanation of a set of facts, an account of why this phenomenon had occurred. As the Oxford English Dictionary states, a system of ideas or statements held as an explanation or account of a group of facts or phenomena. But theory also has, even in science, a prescriptive or normative enterprise. Even theories of natural science, as philosophers of science have explored, even theories of natural science permit hypotheses or predictions about what will occur. The idea is that what has occurred in the past will occur again. So there's a prescriptive dimension of theory. Theory says that that the rules of natural science and the behaviour of objects give us a clue to how those objects are going to behave in the future. The Oxford English Dictionary, in this sense, calls theory a conceptual mental scheme of something to be done, or the method of doing it, a systematic statement of rules or principles to be followed. This is even clearer when the object of the theory is social phenomena or norms of behaviour, because these are things that we can, to a great extent, change. So even if there's a prescriptive element in natural science, the rules about what have happened in the past prescribe what's going to happen in the future. When it comes to social behaviour, the theories of why conflict has arisen or some division has occurred, and the theories of why that problem came about and the parameters for resolving it, assume that our social behaviour, our norms of behaviour, is to a large extent open to change. We can change our own behaviour as societies. And theory can, in this sense, help us to modify our behaviour by helping us to identify the proper goals or ends of our behaviour. So it has a prescriptive or normative enterprise in a quite different sense when applied to the social world. Next, let's consider what's meant by political theory, or theory about political institutions, events and behaviours. So this is theory that applies not to the natural world anymore, but to those institutions to which we assign the adjective political. Institutions that apply to the public, that apply to all people, that apply, that involve or rely on or embody values that we also think, at least in a liberal democratic society, should be acceptable to those people to whom they apply. Public in this sense. So political theory also has descriptive and explanatory components. Political theory offers an examination and explanation of a type of political institutions, events and behaviours, just like theories of the physical world do of the natural objects and behaviours, but now applied to the political. So, for example, Rawls' theory of civil disobedience for liberal societies explains why disobedience is to be expected in non-ideal circumstances. Disobedience will come about when societies are terribly unjust, and when societies do not extend basic rights and liberties to all. So it's an explanation, in a sense, of social behaviour. We can see disobedience occurring, and in the time in which John Rawls was writing, not just in the forms of civil disobedience that were occurring in protesting civil rights, in trying to secure civil rights for non-white Americans, but also in the riots that were taking place in response to police brutality. The Watts riots, for example, and other riots that were occurring. So disobedience, here we have an explanation. Disobedience is to be expected in non-ideal circumstances where justice doesn't obtain. Even more importantly, though, political theory is prescriptive and normative. It seeks to shape the political world. It says what should occur, even if it hasn't occurred yet. So it's prescriptive in the sense of trying to provide an account both of why these events have taken place and to give us the resources to think through what should be done. So Rawls' theory of civil disobedience, we'll discover in week 3 when we look at this more closely, says that all persons should have equal basic rights and liberties, and even though non-white Americans did not have them in the 60s, it seeks to influence those who read the theories. It seeks to challenge attempts to reduce political science to mere description, what Habermas refers to as the mere scientisation of politics. So it really does rely on this idea that we can modify our political systems ourselves. We don't need to be caught in mere description and explanation. So in general, political theory is not simply concerned with explaining political phenomenon, like why civil disobedience has occurred, but also with whether the political phenomenon should be accepted by us, the conditions under which disobedience should count as civil or uncivil, and how this should be understood jurisprudentially in terms of punishment or leniency. Political theory brings the idea of justification with it. Political phenomena should be justified. If we can't justify the political organisation of our lives, then what are some good reasons for trying to change that organisation, and how should that change be sought? This is a difference between reasons and good reasons, because not all reasons are good reasons. So we've considered briefly what theory means, what political theory might mean, and let's consider now what's meant by contemporary political theory. The article by David Miller did not really get to contemporary political theory. It was about the history of modern political philosophy and why we can see in that history reasons to explain why we might need or benefit from political philosophy now. But in our subject, we're going to focus more narrowly on political theory from around the late 1950s, really early 60s onwards, up until the present. In philosophy, or in the history of modern thought, modern political thought, we often refer, you'll see this in books about history of political philosophy, we often refer to modern political thought as the period in which a significant shift occurred. Instead of justification that relied on traditional or inherited authority, the authority of kings, monarchs, churches or gods, authority that was given to us by some force beyond ourselves, an exterior force beyond our own reason. Instead of this sort of justification, modern political thought relied on the authority of human reason, or the ability of people to give themselves their own laws. This is why courses on the history of political thought tend to begin with Thomas Hobbes onwards. When the wars of the Reformation in Britain in the 16th century suggested that grounding political authority in religion would lead to unending civil war. Hobbes is often presented in courses on the history of modern political thought as one of the key figures who commenced a historical case for justifying political authority in human reason, for grounding political authority in our ability to give ourselves our own laws. Although we're still focusing on political theory as reflecting or derived from the authority of human reason and not from authority, in our subject, we're just going to focus on a small subset of modern political thought here. We're not going to go back to Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau or Kant or any of the main figures that you would study if you were looking at a history of modern political thought. We're going to limit our focus here to contemporary political thought from the late 1950s to the present. So we've mapped out how theory is understood, both descriptive and prescriptive, even for natural science. We've mapped out how this applies to the political theory, where the theory is about those institutions that regulate the lives of everyone, those public institutions. But we now come to John Rawls, a key liberal political philosopher who rejuvenated political philosophy in the late 1960s onwards, who offers a twist. In order to emphasise that theory is primarily about description and explanation in the natural sciences, Rawls tries to distinguish political philosophy from theory. He says we should not view political philosophy as theory in the sense of theory in science. We can, in many respects, change our social world, and theory can help us know how to do that. Theory does not play that role in natural science, even if, as I suggested, it still has some kind of prescriptive role in predicting what's going to come in the future. The predictive and prescriptive role of political theory is different. It's more of a persuasive argument to try and change our society to be better. So he prefers the term political philosophy to political theory because he thinks that the term political philosophy captures this prescriptive or normative element as regards the social and political world much better than the term theory. So Rawls asks, who is the audience of political philosophy? And he answers, political philosophy is directed at society. This means directing his thinking at the body of citizens of a democratic society, you and me, who are reading his work. Who writes political philosophy? Well, people do. You and me. I write political philosophy. You're going to write political philosophy in this subject. John Rawls writes political philosophy. Are we experts? Not really. There's no such thing as expertise in political philosophy. It's not produced by experts. It's not a body of fundamental truths about society, but you can do it in better ways and in worse ways. It's a persuasive argument about what should be the case. What are its claims to authority? Well, if we mean legal standing, Rawls argues, it has no authority whatsoever, nor does it have any authoritative political weight. Politicians don't really refer to political philosophy. Maybe in France sometimes they do or did. Certainly not in Australia and not in America. Nobody really refers to political philosophy as a politician. Nor does it have any evidential force. It only has authority to the extent that people read works from the tradition of political philosophy and are affected by it. And Rawls points out that even if we say that political philosophy has the authority of human reason, political philosophy still has no more authority than your reason, or my reason, or John Rawls's reason. So, as I pointed out on the previous slide, often the history of modern political philosophy commences with a moment in time where researchers say political authority became the source or ground of political authority became conceptualized differently, no longer given to us by an external authority like God, King, and so forth, but rather given to us by ourselves through our own reason, being our own law. But Rawls reminds us that even if we say that political philosophy has the authority of human reason, what is human reason? It's just the reason of you and me and John Rawls. It's just what we as a society judge to be worthy of the name. But we do think there are good reasons as opposed to bad reasons and better reasons. So it will have authority. But we all have that authority as people who can reason. And Rawls asks, how does political philosophy have its effects? And importantly, this is one of the crucial parts of his answer, it has an educative role. It's educative as part of our background culture. It educates you and me to certain ways of thinking about ourselves in relation to others. And these ways of thinking about ourselves, because they're in the background culture, are also embodied in our educational institutions, schools, primary schools, high schools, and in the way in which we talk about political institutions as well. So if contemporary political theory is not theory like natural science, it is because of the aspect of theory on the previous page that we emphasised as different to the natural sciences, the prescriptive and normative dimension, where theory can suggest to us ways of reorganising our society in a manner differently to what's gone on before. Sticking with Rawls, he argues that political philosophy must fulfil 4 roles. It must fulfil a practical role. When there's divisive political conflict, political philosophy's task is to focus on those deeply disputed questions and to see whether, quote, despite appearances, some underlying basis of philosophical and moral agreement can be uncovered, or differences can be at least narrowed so that social cooperation on a footing of mutual respect among citizens can still be maintained. Political philosophy must also orient us. It can help us identify our basic aims and purposes as a society with a history, as opposed to the aims that we might have as individuals or in families or in associations. Political philosophy must also fulfill the role of reconciliation. It can also calm our frustration and our rage against society, Rawls argues. It can calm our rage against society and its history by showing us the way in which its institutions, when properly understood, are rational and have emerged over time to attain their present form. Let's flag that one for further discussion. It must also fulfill the role of probing the limits of practical possibility. It must be a realistic utopia. Political philosophy can help us identify the sort of world or ideas for a better world where these ideas are not impractical. They must be able to be implemented and actually practically instituted. Before we turn to the second question of this lecture, which is why we might be interested in studying political philosophy, let me try to explain why Rawls's views were very important in the 1960s onwards. They were quite radical for their times, and they spelled a new era for political philosophy. This is because in the UK in the 1950s, political philosophy was viewed basically as impossible. This was the effect of logical positivism, which was the main philosophical framework at that time. And while it made sense that in a context of competing ideological views of science linked to the place of science in Nazi and fascist regimes across the 1930s and 40s, while it might make sense for the philosophers to have wanted to reject ideological science and return to the idea of empirical verification and objectivity, it did leave philosophers unable to say very much about moral and political judgments. So logical positivism required that truth statements be empirically verified. So A.J. Ayer, for example, said that we could discern what sort of statements would be candidates for truth. And they were ones that would have a clear sense of what would empirically verify them. And even if we couldn't empirically verify them now, we would know what would be needed to do so. So we could make statements about the moon and observe whether or not those statements were true. Even the statement, there are mountains on the far side of the moon, even though we couldn't at that stage empirically verify that because we hadn't yet sent people to the moon, we knew in principle that a statement like that would be empirically verifiable if we could get somebody to the far side of the moon. So these were truth statements that could either be pronounced true with evidence or that could be pronounced as candidates for truth. But moral and political judgments were not candidates for truth in this way because nobody knew what would be needed to empirically verify them. Did moral and political judgments that were right give you a better feeling? Not always. Did they make you feel happy? No. Sometimes they made you feel sick. So the subjectivity around moral and political judgments could not be overcome, and we didn't know what we would be testing to try and determine their truth. They weren't candidates for truth. They were doing something else to the logical positivists. So the logical positivist philosophers in the UK thought that moral and political judgments were just subjective expressions of emotion, like saying, hooray for charity, or boo for murder. And that left them really unable to say anything normative or prescriptive about what should be done, about how political institutions should be regulated. But John Rawls and others in the US saw things very differently. Why? Well, in my view, this is because they began with the problem of divisive conflict, and they assumed that it could be resolved. They developed a methodology for helping us think through why that divisive conflict had occurred, a form of explanation, and how we might think through responding to that divisive conflict if we conceptualized ourselves both as the type of people that have that conflict and as the type of people endowed with the faculties that allow us to resolve that conflict. And so it was a very different starting point. It accepted that truth statements about the world and its truth were different to moral and political judgments, but that good arguments and good reasons could still be made to favour some moral and political judgments over others. And this was really important for them, they believed, in a context where division was so clear in the 1960s. It was increasingly visible across the 1960s and the 1970s in the US. And so US political philosophers started there. They were not willing to, they overcame that crisis of confidence of the UK philosophers and said, no, we just need to work out a different way of talking about moral and political judgments with reference to our ability to give ourselves good reasons and to talk to each other about it and persuade each other as part of an educative background culture. So it was quite radical for that time. And in the recommended reading, I've provided you with 2 chapters that explain what was going on in the UK in the 1950s and how the US political philosophers in the 1960s, like John Rawls, were very different. Let's turn to part 2, why study contemporary political theory today? In a sense, I've given you the answer on the previous page. We need contemporary political theory today to contribute to an educative background culture to help us think through divisive conflicts. That is, in a sense, Rawls, in a nutshell, Rawls's answer. Political philosophy can help us think our way through divisive conflicts and play a practical role for us. It can help us make a case for the basic aims and purposes of our society, to orient us. It can calm our frustration to reconcile ourselves to aspects of our society that are different to our own individual values. And again, I flag that for further discussion. And it can help us to work towards a better world, a practical utopia that we can actually bring into effect, that we can institute. Again, we have no more authority than anyone else in this. Everybody has human reason to use. We may or may not be successful in our use of our human reason, but what we are doing is contributing to an educative background culture where this sort of thinking will hopefully make some difference. But we need to move beyond Rawls's answer too. And it's in particular that third role of political philosophy that I find quite challenging. Rawls, when he's discussing this, as you may have noticed in your required reading, says that it's important, if political philosophy is to play the role of reconciliation, that it doesn't also become mere ideology. It can't become mere ideology. We have to make sure that we're just not accepting. We're not reconciling ourselves blindly to aspects of a society that we should actually be rejecting. But he doesn't really delve into detail about how we might do that. And so we need to move beyond Rawls's answer and say that we also want to study contemporary political theory today to bring critical attention to contemporary political theory itself, asking how we might ourselves contribute to improvements in the background culture, political philosophy in our own times. We don't want to reconcile ourselves to aspects of our society that are different to our own individual values necessarily. If we think that we shouldn't be reconciling ourselves to those aspects, if we have good reasons to think that we don't want to reconcile ourselves anymore. And this dimension, this critical attention to contemporary political theory itself will also drive our subject, because we'll consider how liberal political philosophers have answered certain questions about civil disobedience, conscientious objection, the family, reproductive rights, and so forth. And we'll consider more radical criticisms of liberal approaches, which suggest reasons for not being prepared to reconcile ourselves to those aspects of society that a liberal or Rawlsian approach might have suggested we need to reconcile ourselves to. So we'll try and bring that critical dimension into our subject as well. So you now know that we are not going to be studying political philosophy as if it's abstracted from historical context. We're going to be studying it as it emerged in response to the divisive conflicts of the post-war period in the US. And in each module, I've provided you with a historical text, not just texts from political philosophy, but in the recommended readings, you will find texts that really map out what those divisive conflicts were with respect to the topic that we're considering. So we look at the historical conflicts. We begin with that. The cases where conflict and division seemed intractable, and where political philosophers offered accounts of how to organise political institutions based on reasons that they felt should be acceptable to reasonable others. And we'll look at those accounts. When we study political philosophy emerging in these contexts, we'll look first at the liberal political philosophers who wrote in the 1960s and 70s. And we'll show how their work relied on concepts of the person that both explained why the divisive conflict had occurred, a form of descriptive explanation, even if Rawls wants to resist the idea that political philosophy plays that role. It still does. That's why I began there. And then we'll look at how those concepts of the person can also provide the parameters for a solution, a normative prescription, a theory about what should be done and not just what is. But we won't end with the liberal political philosophers of the 1960s and 70s. We'll employ critical perspectives beyond Rawls and his friends. We'll ask, how did the liberal political philosophies themselves permit exclusion and oppression? For example, when we look at civil disobedience, we'll notice not just the effort of political philosophers like Rawls to make headway in a context of a divisive conflict, but also the way that the theories they proposed could not provide a justification for disobedience in response to economic injustice. And we'll ask whether we really do find that reasonable, whether that really is something that should be acceptable to reasonable others. This is relevant to us today if you look at the prosecution of disobedience who are using civil disobedience to promote responses to climate crisis. Their sentences seem not to make sense of the gravity of the situation in which we are in. And yet the theories of civil disobedience that have now become embodied in law do tend to reflect these liberal conceptions of civil disobedience in ways that stymie the extension of civil disobedience to encompass other reasons beyond securing equal basic rights and liberties. What of climate justice? What of economic justice? Or what of climate injustice? What of economic injustice? So those are the questions we now need to pose in relation to these liberal political philosophies. So I now turn to a broad subject overview so that you can get a sense of the logic of this subject and how we will progress through it. So how are we going to study political philosophy in this subject? Well, we're going to return to the divisive conflicts in history that were a motivation for political philosophers in the US to overcome the crisis of confidence of their UK counterparts and really start to try and elaborate arguments that they felt would be acceptable to people about their political institutions. And so we begin with those conflicts in the 1960s and the 1970s, but we also consider their relevance to today, and we also bring a critical perspective on some of the theories that were proposed. So in Module 1, we begin with racial segregation and the civil rights movement in the 1960s in America. And we look at political theories of disobedience, civil disobedience. We look first at the religious arguments that were made by Martin Luther King. And we look then at John Rawls' reinterpretation of those religious arguments along liberal lines. John Rawls provided a liberal theory to defend civil disobedience in this context. However, we'll move beyond those theories, beyond the liberal theories of civil disobedience, to start looking at civil disobedience itself and those theories embodied in law as forms of social control. And we'll look at radical theories of civil disobedience by other more recent thinkers who've been concerned to think through the moral grounds or the ambivalent moral grounds of rioting in the context of injustice and impotence and political impotence, and why the liberal constraints on what counts as civil forms of disobedience might need to be loosened. We'll look at Module 2. We'll look in Module 2 at the Vietnam War and how the Vietnam War provided a context for divisive conflict too. We'll see how political philosophers developed theories of unjust war and conscientious objection, and we'll consider some of their concerns about pacifism. In Module 3, we'll turn to the sexual liberation movement and beyond, across the 1960s and 70s and into the present. We'll look at the political theories of the family that were proposed by liberal thinkers like John Rawls in the 1960s and 70s, and how Rawls's theory became a target of friendly liberal critics, friendly liberal feminist critics in the women's movement. We'll look at those theories of justice between and within families and liberal theories of the family. However, we'll move beyond those to also look at how from the late 1970s on into the 80s and 90s, how we see the rise of conservative and neoliberal criticisms of these liberal theories, where families become depicted as agents of self-help. And finally, we'll turn to radical and queer criticisms of liberal theory. These are theories offered by political theorists about how families themselves reproduce exclusionary norms in relation to gender identification and race, and how political institutions might need to be restructured to overcome those exclusions. In Module 4, we'll turn to reproductive technologies and political rights. The 1960s and the 70s spelt watershed developments in reproductive freedoms in the United States. So we saw the first birth control clinics receiving federal funding as part of the war on poverty in the 1960s. And we see legal cases confirming that married couples, only married couples at this stage, have a right to legal contraception. They can't be prevented from accessing contraceptives in the post. We also then see the immense impact of the Roe versus Wade case, which prohibited states from preventing abortion services in those states. So we'll look in this context at arguments for abortion in liberal theory and for conscientious objection in health. We'll move beyond liberal theory and its pro-choice, pro-life terms to think about these same issues in the context of reproductive justice. because birth control technologies and clinics in America also had a seedy history, an undesirable past linked to genocidal fears in the birth clinics targeting black families. And we'll look at the claims of the reproductive justice theorists about what really we should be striving to achieve in reproduction, and what reproductive justice might mean, and how political institutions should be designed to permit this. We'll look finally, having tracked through these different key debates that grew out of the 1960s and 1970s with the immense social turmoil that was emerging around racial integration, civil rights, unjust war, sexual liberation, reproductive freedoms and technologies. Having extended that to the present, we will end the subject by thinking about what political philosophy might mean now and in the future. And we'll end rather provocatively with the work of Global South writer and also a eco-feminist sci-fi philosopher, Donna Haraway, considering what it might mean to live well and die well in a context of ecosystem collapse and what this means for our political institutions. And that's a kind of provocation on my part to get you to think about what you think the pressure points are for divisive conflict right now, and allow you to think about how you would develop your own political philosophies in response. And you will have a chance to do that in your final assessment for the unit, which I hope should be fun. You have got a lot of freedom in that last piece of assessment. So that's the overview of the subject as a whole. So just a short brief on what you have upcoming and what to expect in the coming weeks. So this is week 1. I want you to do your reading, your required reading, and come into the tutorial and meet me in person or online on Thursday. In week 2, you've got your lecture, your reading, and your tutorial again. I'd like you to keep up with your reading in these early weeks, because at the end of week 3, you'll have a short paper due on civil disobedience to try to put together your knowledge on what political philosophy is and why the theories of civil disobedience that we're studying are good examples of political philosophy in response to divisive conflict. I'm looking forward to meeting you on Thursday, and all the best until then.